Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. I'm very pleased to be joined today by a new author, Melanie Jones Quarles, who is a womanist ethicist, ordained Baptist preacher, assistant professor of ethics, theology, and culture, and director of the Katy Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. And we are so happy to have published her fabulous, I would say, new book, which is called Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption. I should say that this is one of the first volumes in a new Orbis series called Ethics and Intersectionality, and I think it's quite appropriate for this topic since womanist theology and ethics, I think, is the premier expression of intersectionality, since it specifically addresses themes of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Over 30 years ago, I was privileged to publish one of the classic works of womanist theology, which was Dolores Williams' Sisters in the Wilderness. It's a book that's prominently referenced in this work. And I genuinely believe that this book is a worthy successor to that. And like Dolores Williams, you employ what you call a parallel biblical method that reads a biblical text, in her case, the story of Hagar in the wilderness, alongside the experience of Black women. In your case, your book is bracketed by the story of your grandmother and the gospel story of Jesus healing a woman with a bent back. And I wondered if you could begin by describing how those two stories underlie and frame the theme of your book.
Yeah, thank you so much. I first want to say, thank you, Robert, for setting up this time for us to get together and to dialogue about the project. And even more so thankful for Orbis seeing the project, its value, and wanting to publish it. And so it's just been a joy to have this opportunity. I think one of the greatest accomplishments, especially as a womanist scholar, and I consider myself as a daughter of the tradition, even now, as of course I'm teaching and leading the K. Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leaderships. But I see myself in many ways learning from these first generation, second generation, third generation for persons, and am navigating this space as a millennial womanist, as a fourth generation womanist who has drawn from their kind of methodologies and thought about questions that would engage my particular context and community. And that's exactly where Dolores Williams' womanist biblical hermeneutic of parallel became important for me when I thought about not only returning to my own kind of grandmother's gardens or likening to Alice Walker's notion in search of our mother's gardens. When I
Mhm.
returned back to the story of my grandmother, there were so many nuances and connections that I saw with that bent woman in Luke 13. And asking myself, my grandmother as a woman who was a migrant, a domestic who migrated from the South to Chicago to the North, who had particular experiences when she made it to Chicago of navigating single motherhood and class and all other kinds of challenges. I noticed that in the last quarter of her life that she spent that last quarter bent over. Her osteoporosis literally bent her over. And it came at her passing when I saw something profound happen. Was that the first time when she was pronounced as that she had declined, that her body for that first time had laid straight that I hadn't seen in 25 years prior,
Mhm.
which told me about the possibility for transformation, liberation, which is what we see exactly that happens in the Lucan paradigm. But I'm wanting, in my grandmother's experience, for that to be an experience that Black women can have in life and not in death. Because that's exactly what we see in the Lucan narrative, that this is something that she experiences in terms of liberation from Jesus or because of Jesus in life, and is able to be raised to a greater and more noble social status than she had before.
Mhm. Maybe you should just remind listeners about what that story is with the bent woman in Luke.
Yeah, it's a passage in Luke 13, 10, and 17. And it narrates this woman who came to the synagogue where Jesus is teaching, and she is bent over. The text says she's bent over and she can't stand up straight, which gives us some kind of a signal that perhaps there's some double bendedness happening, or something that has bent her over. And though there have been former or traditional readings of that text to suggest that this is a kind of disability that is a result of perhaps something that has happened prior. The text also gives us a sense that there were some social forces based upon how we might read that text that might be bending her over. In that capacity, Jesus recognizes this woman. Jesus notices her. Jesus touches her. Jesus announces to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." And there's something also that happens in the text was that Jesus recognizes that there is a community that has been seeing this woman bent over, but is
Mhm.
also not being participatory in her liberation. And Jesus does a double healing of sorts
Mm,
to not only heal the woman, but also call out the community that is around her that is participating in not contributing to her healing. So,
mm,
and likewise, I think that's exactly what I'm doing in the book, right? I'm saying, what are the possibilities for Black women to live whole and free? But also, is there some confrontation that's necessary with the Black church in particular, and perhaps the society that has misrecognized Black women's virtue? And there's some confrontation that we need to call out
mm,
those
mm,
systems that
mm.
have, in some ways, not enable or not sustain Black women's thriving.
Well, you, among other things, you call out specifically, elements of the Black church. I think, in a way, you could say some of your foremothers called out James Cone and Black liberation theology for also not seeing, recognizing uh, Black women's bodies, and he profited from that and gave credit to them for that challenge, benefited from it. Reading this book, you really do feel and you convey the weight of hundreds of years of oppression on the backs of Black women. And quote Zora Neale Hurston is saying Black women are the mule of the world. Katie Cannon, the oppressed of the oppressed. But you also, what major theme is of the role of Black women as agents of redemption or renewal, both in society and in the church.
Mhm. Yeah, I echo Jacqueline Grant and others, right, who spoke back to Black liberation theology, Cone in particular, their teacher,
Mhm.
to say, if Black liberation has no word for Black women and Black children, then its vision of liberation is inauthentic. In a similar vein, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to convey to the Black church is that when we began to kind of trace the social history of the kind of formation of not only the Black church, but of the formation of the Black social gospel,
Mhm.
of course, right, we cannot eliminate Black women's contributions that continue to be significant to the formation of Black priestly traditions, Black prophetic traditions, Black radical traditions, and so forth. At the same time, you're right, it is a confrontation, and it echoes in this sense works by Ebony Marshall Turman and others who have spoken to not only what happens to Black women, what happens to their bodies, but also what's possible and what happens in Black women and what they are called and motivated to do, that agency that is a reflective in what they've been doing, but also what we might envision as this continuing and ongoing work, and that to be to participate in pursuing justice on all fronts and confronting these a community and society, this faith, their faith communities and society, about calling for a more inclusive vision of liberation that includes all of us.
You note that this passage in the Gospel of Luke has not received a great deal of exegetical attention, but ironically, one of the places where it's received a lot of attention is in the Black church with Bishop T.D. Jakes, who's built a whole ministry around this theme of "Woman, thou art loosed," but in a very different interpretation or understanding than you bring to it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a womanist theological ethicist, with full recognition that I'm not a womanist biblicist, but also in the tradition of Dolores Williams and others who find, uh, Katie Cannon and others, that the Bible is a source of authority for Black women. And much like, as you said earlier, we've read the narrative of Hagar with a close read for the liberative dimensions of text in that way. I'm also taking up this New Testament Lucan account to say, wait a minute, when we look at contemporary experiences of Black practitioners, there is some Black women, Black church women who are drawing into and really feel themselves connected to that passage in Luke 13. Part of my challenge with the reading or the rendering that Bishop Jakes offer is, I think it is a liberative passage for Black women. I'm concerned, though, if we continue to script that woman as one who is disabled by a reality of her own making,
Mhm,
right? Or this sense that she is the problem that has created her predicament.
mhm.
I want to push against that very notion and suggest no, there are some social forces, systems of oppression that are worked, and there are some vicious, crooked ways that our churches, as well as our society, has made the conditions or the context by which Black women encounter to be navigating a crooked, hostile world, and as a result, had to contort themselves in various ways in
Mhm.
order to stand up straight. And I think confronting those systems might be a way for us to get at this is not a problem that they've done, but rather a problem that we need to contend with as a community.
Yeah, in a way, I think you say, in effect, that Black women have had to live in a bent system that bends them. And in the case of your grandmother, among other things, working incredibly hard in a big hotel on her hands and knees, and what that did to her health. But uh, there, you kind of look at all of the different kind of dimensions, social, political, economic, uh, and religious, that contribute to that contortion of Black women carrying that kind of weight.
Absolutely. I think that these are multidimensional forces, right? Early womanists would have looked at this in terms of race, gender, class. I follow along contemporary womanists who are thinking of this as multidimensionality, that it is race, gender, and class, but it is also sexuality. There's also ableism at work, right? There's also religious oppression. So there are a number of ways by which we might characterize oppression that functions against Black women, which forces us to engage this upon amongst multiple fronts. That this has some religious dimensions, it has some political dimensions, it has some historical dimensions, and so I try to at least engage a few of those as we throughout the book.
Well, in the chapter on the Black women's role, the burden of saving democracy was fascinating to see that really spelled out that kind of red thread that runs through history, and where time and again, and you name some of the people, Coretta Scott King, of course, and Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer, and the role of Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, Stacey Abrams, and in Georgia, and others you can mention, who have it's been said, commented on some of the recent election cycles, that for instance, that it was it was Black women who kind of decided that Biden had to be the candidate, elevated him and allowed him to appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court and a vice presidential candidate who then became a presidential candidate. But over and over again, and I think that Harris, I believe, received 92% of the vote of Black women, probably the strongest support in the country. But over and over again, this a group that has been the oppressed of the oppressed, playing this extremely important role in kind of redeeming the soul of America, and without getting the recognition that they are due for that.
Absolutely. I think that language of Black women saved America that we've seen as a result of recent election cycles is something that I'm trying to trace is not new to
Yeah.
Black women.
Mhm.
And you're right, those names of Coretta Scott and others, right, that were formers and masterminds in many ways of the civil rights movement, their political engagement was not often recognized. And moving into contemporary times, we still see that struggle for recognition there. I think part of our challenge, even as we navigate that, is not only the misrecognition, but the sense that Black women are not just here to clean up political
Yeah.
messes, right? And we see that in some of the phantasmic imagination or imaging through Scandal and other kinds of shows or popular culture references that suggest, we're the cleanup crew. When the bottom has fell out, call on Black women to clean it all up.
Yeah.
Really only kind of further brings into this characterization of Black women as perpetually and politically, right, seen as these caricatures
Mhm.
of who I think we are not in many ways, and is not fully recognizing the ways that we've been so integral in the fabric, the moral fabric of this nation.
Mhm. 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 The you follow that by the chapter on kind of redeeming the soul of the church as well, the role of Black women in the Black church in particular. But I was very struck by the chapter that with about Black women being near the cross, that kind of theme, following in the line of the women who accompanied Jesus to Calvary and were there with him. How does that play out for you? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned during the research for the project was that a number of Black women said that they were able to be engaged in kind of politics in many ways because they learned how to do this in the Black church, that these spaces were their kind of foregrounding for navigating challenging and difficult political terrain. In that, this question of when we think about this theologically of suffering and salvation, and when we return back to my grandmother's experience, I narrate of being buried near cross with crosses all near her. What does it mean for women, Black women in particular, to be perpetually near the cross? What does that signal for us? And for me, that meant for us to return back to that narrative and those narratives all throughout the gospel, right? That signal that the women were there, many women were there, Matthew's gospel suggests, where they were there from not only Jesus' birth, Jesus' life, but certainly there during the crucifixion, were there to prepare his body, and then were, of course, the first to discover the resurrection and ultimately the first, I believe, heralds of the gospel. All of that gives some connection that Black women have been near the cross, and we don't want to be on the cross. Because that's something that, as Joanne Terrell would acknowledge for us, that Jesus has already done the work for us in that way. But perpetually staying near the cross is a recognition that Jesus suffers with us, recognizes our suffering, is not new to suffering, but understands that suffering, and that Jesus is at work with us in helping us to fight towards or to move towards redemption, even as we navigate that suffering towards salvation.
mm,
I really like that because one of the things in that chapter is comes a little bit earlier is because part of what I'm trying to articulate is that these kind of reflections about the cross are not something that we need to wait towards the end, but actually the
mm,
cross bears this orientation as an empty cross, this
mm,
possibility of resurrection and new life. And what might liberation look for us in life? Back to that question, and not in death.
mm,
So we
mm,
must attend to how the cross moments bring us towards that reckoning with suffering, but how it propels us to think more about that resurrected life and what's necessary for recognition for Black women in that.
mm. I was very struck by you draw on an idea of Katie Cannon, uh, that the three canonical virtues of Black women's moral wisdom are invisible dignity, quiet grace, and unshouted courage.
Mm.
What does all that mean to you?
Yeah. Katie Cannon is quintessential virtue ethicist, especially womanist virtue ethicist, and is mined for us over throughout the 19th century and through the 20th century ways that Black women have been able to show up and advocate their own agency, particularly in the midst of or against devastating and defeating odds. And she names this invisible dignity, as you say, quiet grace, unshouted courage. Part of my interest, and I often you could see that notated in how I set up the language, but I put a slash between in and visible and un and shouted and talked about pronounced grace because one of the things in terms of description, I think those are virtues that Black women have had to operate in. But I want to call Black women in terms of prescription to visible dignity and to being recognized for their human dignity towards some constructions of enunciated grace or pronounced grace and shouted courage.
Mhm,
Because I think that too is also recognized and needs to be recognized as virtuous for Black women as we navigate these times.
mhm. Your last chapter has a title, Hitting a Straight Line with a Crooked. Did I get that right? Is it
Hitting a straight lick
lick, a
with a
lick? I
crooked.
wrote that. Hitting a straight lick with a crooked line and a crooked stick, excuse me. I'm sorry. And I, even though I read the book, I'm still not really understand what that folk line means. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that is directly attributed to Zora Neale Hurston by way of Katie Cannon. It was one of the ways that she used to talk about the task of the womanist ethicist. And partially what she speaks to, Katie Cannon speaks to, is the task of the womanist ethicist is always somewhat challenging of navigating the academy while also being somewhat outside of it, that our roles are often dual. I think what Zora Neale Hurston speaks to is the truth of Black women's experiences, even navigating a crooked, hostile world. The truth of their experiences exposes how they've been able to speak back to or talk back to or confront these systems, even that have in many ways made it possible for them not to be able to survive. They've survived regardless. So it speaks to persistence. It speaks to the relentlessness, and in this quest for justice, that regardless of the conditions, that Black women have still pursued ways for justice seeking and wisdom bearing and truth telling despite devastating odds.
Mm, mm, mm. I you allude to this, in the beginning of the book and also at the end, the important role that your grandmother's death had in suggesting not only the topic or the theme of this book, but the kind of direction of your own theological, ethical, pursuit of study and reflection. Uh, and could you say a little bit more about that? You talked about her bent body and how that connected there, but it's more than that. Her sufferings, her the burden she carried, her grace, her unshouted courage, a lot of things.
Absolutely. I think, I started my doctoral work as a religious historian. And in many ways, you probably see a lot of history in the book because I don't think you ever leave that. But the experience, the profound experience, of knowing and reckoning with, at one point my grandmother was bent over, and then there were possibilities for transformation or a transfigured body that was able to recover in as she transitioned, recover from that bendedness, really sparked these theological questions, theoethical questions about Black women's bodies. What are the power? What are the wisdom that our bodies teach us, that propel for me a different orientation and a new discipline in many ways to take up about justice seeking and justice making that is directly related to embodiment. I think what I try to narrate in that first chapter is that this turn to the body is really indicative of Black religious studies or studies of Black religion, that we've seen that an increasing interest in embodiment continues to emerge. And that is as we reposition ways in which Western theology and philosophy, how the body has been used as a kind of loci, but also been scripted as a problem,
Mm.
forces Black thinkers, Black scholars, Black religious scholars to turn to the body as a way of thinking and rethinking our theological questions, theoethical questions. And so I think that that is what motivates my turn there.
You talk about grandmother theology, or you began by talking about working out of your exploring your grandmother's garden, and I thought that that's also a kind of sign of fecundity, that your grandmother's burdens and life and what she dealt with and her sufferings, but also her prayers, kind of gave birth to you and to this work. And I loved, I just have to kind of conclude, I think, with the way your book concluded. I loved it so much. Speaking of your grandmother, you said, "This book is a product of her answered prayers. Indeed, this book belongs to my ancestors' wildest dreams." That was beautiful.
I absolutely think that I'm drawing from Kelly Brown Douglas when she talks in Stand Your Ground about Trayvon Martin's death and how do you begin to make meaning out of loss, right?
Mm,
Or even in What's Faith Got to Do with It when she talks about returning back to questions, deep questions that she has about Christianity because of the faith of her grandmothers.
mm,
For
mm,
me, that's a similar return back to confronting the Black church, confronting our society to say, on behalf of Black women, but especially because of the faith of my grandmother, I think these questions we must attend to.
Well, one of the personal pleasures of the book for me was kind of revisiting so many Orbis authors that appear over the last 30, 40 years in make appearances in your book, and a lot of books, a lot of authors that I've had the privilege of working with, and I love the way that you kind of catch that stream and carry it forward into a new generation. And this book is a gift to their memory and their achievements, a gift to your ancestors, but it was really a gift to me as well. And I want to really thank you for joining me today and for writing this book.
Thank you for having me. And again, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with you. And I'm just so grateful for this opportunity.
Well, I sincerely hope this won't be the last book you do with Orbis.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.